The land was wide and dry, stretching out to the horizon in shades of brown and gray. Dust clung to the wind, settling on the cracked earth, on the fences, on the man who moved among them. Jacob leaned against a weathered post, his hand tight on the hammer, the steady rhythm of nails driving wood into place. He worked from dawn until nightfall, day after day, as though the fences were the only thing keeping him upright. The townsfolk said Jacob lived for the land. Some admired him, some pitied him. Most agreed on one thing: he wanted no part of love, not after what had come before. When asked, he would answer the same way, his voice flat as the dust. No romance, just fences. It became his saying, a wall of words to keep others away. The ranch was quiet except for the groan of cattle and the creak of the windmill. No laughter, no warmth, just the work, endless and heavy. Jacob's boots wore deep trails in the dirt between barn, corral, and field. Paths repeated so often they looked like scars across the land. At night, when the lantern burned low, he would sit by the window and stare into the dark. Sometimes he heard the faint echo of music from the town saloon, carried on the breeze. Once, maybe, he might have walked into that glow, sought company, a smile, a touch of ease. But not anymore. The fences were his life, and the fences kept him safe. Some men told stories about him, how he carried ghosts in his silence. They said behind his calm eyes was a man who had lost more than most could bear. Yet he never spoke of it, never confirmed nor denied. He just drove his cattle, mended his fences, and built a life out of dust and grit. The drought that year was biting, sharp as barbed wire. The grass grew thin and the soil cracked wider each day. Jacob shouldered it without complaint, for he had nothing else to do but endure. Work was his answer to every trouble. If the well ran low, he dug deeper. If the cattle grew weak, he rode farther for pasture. If the loneliness pressed hard, he pressed harder back with labor. And still the silence grew heavier. One morning, as the sun lifted red over the plain, Jacob set out again with hammer and wire. He paused to wipe his brow, his gaze sweeping the road that cut through his land. Rarely did travelers pass that way, too empty, too unforgiving. But that day dust rose on the horizon. A wagon, small and slow, was pulled by a tired horse. Jacob narrowed his eyes. Strangers seldom came this far. He leaned against the fence post and waited, watching as the wagon rolled closer, every jolt showing its age. When it stopped near his gate, a woman stepped down. She wore a plain dress, travel-worn, the hem marked with dust. She carried no finery, only a trunk and a letter tucked close in her hand. Jacob said nothing at first. He wasn't a man for many words, and strangers weren't his concern. But something about the way she stood, straight-backed though weary, kept his eyes on her. She lifted her chin and met his stare, steady though her voice carried a trace of city softness. "My name is Eleanor," she said. "I was told to come here." Her words hung in the dry air between them. Jacob wiped his hands on his trousers, uncertain what to do with this woman who looked as out of place as roses in the desert. She did not look away. Jacob didn't answer right away. He studied the letter she held out, its edges worn from travel. Slowly he took it, turning it in his rough hands. The paper bore the mark of the preacher in town, a man Jacob knew well enough. The letter spoke plainly. A widow from the city had lost her husband and sought a place to work, a roof to cover her, a chance to begin again. Jacob lowered the paper, his eyes fixed on her. "I don't need help," he said, his voice dry as the earth. "You need someone to cook and keep the house," Eleanor replied. Her tone wasn't sharp, only certain, as though she had rehearsed these words on the long road west. "And I need work." Jacob looked toward the house. Its windows shuttered, porch boards warped, dust thick on the sills. A man could live with such neglect, but a woman like her, she would notice every empty corner. "Still," he said, "this is no place for you. The land's hard. The people are harder." Eleanor's eyes softened, but she did not step back. "I've known hard. Hard doesn't scare me." Her answer stirred something he hadn't expected, a faint flicker beneath the weight of his silence. He didn't welcome it, but he didn't dismiss her either. After a long pause, he gave a small nod. "You can stay." "On trial," he said. "No promises." Eleanor inclined her head. "I don't ask for promises." With that, Jacob carried her trunk inside. The rooms were dim, the air stale. She set to work at once, opening shutters, sweeping floors, striking a fire to chase off the chill that clung even in daylight. Jacob watched a moment, then returned to his fences as though nothing had changed. But things had changed. He could feel it. By evening, the smell of stew drifted from the kitchen. It had been years since Jacob sat down to a meal not cooked by his own hands, and he ate in silence, careful not to show the small comfort it gave him. Eleanor ate too, calm and steady, not pressing him with questions. Only once did she speak. "You've lived alone a long while." Jacob set down his spoon. "I prefer it that way." She nodded and said no more. After the meal, Jacob stepped outside. The night spread wide and cool. Stars scattered bright across the sky. He leaned against the rail, listening to the sound of dishes being washed inside. The house, once silent as a grave, now carried a living rhythm. He wasn't sure if he liked it. He wasn't sure if he feared it. Days passed, each one marked by Jacob's labor and Eleanor's quiet presence. She moved through the house with a steadiness that surprised him. She planted flowers in a tin by the window. She hummed while she worked. A sound so soft it barely reached beyond the walls, yet it stayed in his ears even after it faded. The townsfolk soon noticed. Word spread that Jacob had taken in a widow from the city. Some smirked, calling her too fine for the dust. Others whispered that maybe she'd been desperate enough to take whatever life offered. Jacob ignored them, or tried to. But in the evenings when Eleanor sat by the lamp with her sewing, he caught himself watching the calm in her face, the quiet strength in her hands. He told himself it was nothing. No romance, just fences, he reminded himself. And yet, the silence between them was not the same silence as before. The summer sun beat down heavily and the drought worsened. The ground cracked deeper, like old skin, and the cattle grew restless, searching for grass that wasn't there. Jacob worked harder, mending fences, hauling water, and riding farther across the range. His life had always been labor, but now the land seemed bent on breaking him, Eleanor noticed. She brought him cool water when he returned, his shirt dark with sweat and dust clinging to his beard. She said little, but her actions spoke louder than any words. She washed his clothes when he left them by the door, baked bread with the last of the flour, and kept the lantern burning late for his return. At first, Jacob thought she was simply fulfilling the work she had asked for. But one evening, when he sat weary at the table, he found a sprig of wildflowers in a cup by his plate. Small fragile blooms gathered from some dry ditch nearby. He stared at them longer than at the food. Eleanor said nothing about it, only watched him quietly. "Flowers don't last here," Jacob muttered. "They last long enough to remind us life can still grow," she replied. The words stuck with him. In town, the talk about them grew louder. A man like Jacob, so long alone, now had a woman in his house. Some laughed that she'd soften him. Others doubted she'd last through the first true storm. Jacob let their words slide off, but they lingered in his mind, unshaken as burrs in wool. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance, Jacob sat on the porch, sharpening his knife. Eleanor stepped out with 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising into the cool air. She handed one to him and stood beside the rail. For a time, neither spoke. Finally, she said, "Do you ever think the land feels the loneliness too?" Jacob turned his head toward her, frowning slightly. "It's just dirt and grass, but it feeds us, holds us. It must feel the weight of being empty." He had no answer. The thought was strange, but it lingered with him, twisting through the silence of the storm. The next morning, Jacob found her singing softly while she worked, a tune unfamiliar yet warm. He paused in the doorway, listening before stepping back as if he had walked in on something too private. He carried that sound with him all day, even as he fought with stubborn posts and tangled wire. Then came a day when trouble hit harder than before. The well at the far edge of the ranch ran dry. Jacob cursed under his breath, lowering the bucket again and again, only to hear the dull scrape of rope against rock. Water was life, and without it, cattle would die, land would wither, and men would break. He spent hours digging, sweat pouring, hands raw. Eleanor came to the edge of the pit, her shadow falling over him. "Let me help," she said. "This isn't work for you," Jacob grunted, refusing to look up. "It's work for anyone who wants to survive." She lowered herself down, scooping earth with her hands, passing it up in a steady rhythm. Jacob almost told her to leave, but the resolve in her face silenced him. For the first time, someone was in the dirt beside him, sharing the weight. The hours dragged, but with her there, it didn't feel quite as endless. That night they sat by the fire, both covered in dirt, both too tired to speak. And yet the silence between them was different now, softer, carrying something he had not felt in years. Jacob stared into the flames, thinking of the flowers, the song, the shared work. Against his will, he wondered if the fences he built were truly strong enough to hold her out. The weeks stretched on, and the drought showed no mercy. Each day the sky stayed empty, a wide bowl of pale blue that offered no promise of rain. Jacob's cattle grew thin, ribs pressing against their hides, and their restless cries echoed across the barren fields. He drove them farther each morning, searching for grass, for water, for anything that would keep them alive. Eleanor stayed behind, tending the house, but she was no stranger to the struggle. She carried buckets from the nearer well, rationed the food, and found ways to stretch little into more. She kept her voice steady, her hands busy, even when the fear of failing pressed hard against her chest. At night, Jacob returned, shoulders heavy, dust in his hair and beard. He spoke little of what he had seen, dry streams, empty pastures, dying cattle. Yet Eleanor read it in his face. And though he said nothing, she always had food waiting, water drawn, and a quiet place by the fire where he could sit. It was not romance. Not yet. But it was something. One evening, as Jacob sat cleaning his rifle, Eleanor took a seat across from him. The lamplight flickered, catching the calm in her eyes. "Tell me," she said gently, "why do you live this way?" Alone, fences and silence, Jacob's hand stilled on the gun. For a long time he said nothing, the weight of her question hanging heavy in the air. Finally he set the rifle aside and looked at her. "Because it's easier than losing again." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Eleanor didn't press him. She only nodded, her eyes soft, and went back to her sewing. But the truth hung between them now, raw and exposed. After that night, Jacob found himself watching her more closely. The way she brushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. The way she hummed while she worked. The way she carried both sorrow and strength as if they were stitched into her very being. He felt the edges of his silence cracking. Though he fought to keep the pieces together, the town continued to talk. Some men laughed at Jacob, claiming the widow would tame him, tie him down. Others said she was a fool to waste her youth on dust and drought. Eleanor heard the whispers when she went for supplies, but she carried herself with quiet dignity, never answering back. One afternoon, a group of women at the general store tried to press her with questions. "Why live with a man like him? He's nothing but dust and cattle," one said with a sharp tongue. Eleanor lifted her chin. "A man who works as he does deserves more respect than talk like that." Her voice was steady and her gaze did not waver. The women fell silent, unsettled by her calm. When Jacob heard of it later, he said nothing, but inside something shifted. For years he had carried only himself against the weight of the land. Now someone else stood beside him. Unafraid of his silence, unafraid of the dust. Still, he reminded himself, no romance, just fences. But fences, he was beginning to see, could not hold back everything. That night, as he walked the edge of his ranch beneath the stars, Jacob stopped by a fence line he had repaired weeks earlier. He leaned against the post, staring out across the wide, dry land. And for the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone. The drought grew worse. Clouds formed now and then, dark on the horizon, but they always drifted away without dropping a single drop of rain. The cattle grew weak, bones showing beneath their skin. Jacob's jaw stayed tight, his eyes sharp with worry, though he rarely spoke of it. Work was still his answer, but even he knew work could not make rain fall. Eleanor noticed the weight pressing on him. She began rising earlier, walking the fields before sunrise, checking fences, gathering what little herbs or roots she could find. She did not tell Jacob all that she saw, how thin the grass had become, how close the earth seemed to giving up. She saved her words for when they were most needed. One evening, Jacob came in from the far range, his steps heavy. He dropped his hat on the table, sat down hard, and pressed his hands over his face. Eleanor placed a bowl of food before him, but he did not touch it. "They're dying," he said finally, voice low. "I've ridden the whole stretch and it's all the same. Empty, dry, nothing left." Eleanor stood beside him, quiet. Then she set her hand lightly on his shoulder. "You've carried it alone long enough. Let me carry some of it too." Jacob lifted his head, surprised. For a moment he looked at her as though he wanted to believe her words but didn't know how. The next day she proved it. When a calf went missing in the brush, Eleanor saddled a horse and rode with Jacob to search. She had never ridden long miles across rough country, but she stayed with him, holding steady even when the sun burned high and the dust stung her eyes. They found the calf caught in a tangle of wire, weak but alive. Jacob cut it free, and together they led it back. That night he looked across the firelight at her, dirt streaking her face, hair tangled, hands scratched. She caught his gaze and gave a small, weary smile. And something inside Jacob shifted again. Deeper this time, but trouble was not finished with them. A week later, word came of rustlers moving through the territory, men who waited for weakness, who struck when ranches were at their lowest. Jacob knew the signs: gates left open, tracks pressed deep into the dust. He checked the herd each night, his rifle never far from reach. One night the sound of hooves thundered in the distance. Jacob was out of the house before Eleanor could rise, rifle in hand. He spotted shadows moving near the cattle, dark against the moonlight. Shots cracked through the night, sharp and sudden. The rustlers scattered, but not before they drove off part of the herd. Eleanor rushed to the doorway, her heart pounding, watching Jacob ride hard into the dark. Hours later he returned, face set, the herd shaken but not lost. He said little, only sat by the fire, the rifle across his knees. Eleanor knelt beside him. "You can't guard this land alone," she said softly. "Even fences won't keep everything out." Jacob looked into the flames, her words cutting close to the truth he had always fought to avoid. He had built walls around himself, believing they would keep lost from finding him again. But now he saw they also kept out the very thing that gave life meaning. Still, he stayed silent, gripping the rifle as though it could answer what his heart refused to admit. Outside, the cattle settled. Inside, the fire burned low, and between Jacob and Eleanor the silence grew heavy again, but not empty. The raid left its mark. A few cattle lost, more shaken, and Jacob restless as a wolf pacing in a cage. He rode the boundaries twice each day, checking the fences, watching the horizon. The rustlers might return and he would not be caught unready. Eleanor watched him wear himself down. His eyes grew darker, his voice shorter, his shoulders heavier. She tried to steady the home, to keep food on the table, to hold the silence without letting it swallow them both. Yet even she felt the strain. One morning, as Jacob saddled his horse, she stepped out with a cup of water. "You can't fight drought and rustlers and weariness all at once," she told him. Jacob tugged the cinch tight. "I've fought worse." Eleanor's eyes searched his face. "And what did it cost you then?" He froze, the leather strap in his hands. For a moment she thought he might answer. Instead he mounted his horse and rode hard, the dust rising behind him. All day Eleanor tended the house, but her mind wandered. She thought of the man who kept his pain buried, who built fences not just around cattle but around his own heart. She did not come west seeking to heal him, but somehow she could not help but want to. That evening, Jacob returned late, shoulders slumped. He looked at the flowers she had planted weeks ago, now wilted in the window box. He lingered by them, then came inside without a word. They ate in silence until Eleanor set down her spoon. "You think you're protecting yourself," she said quietly. "But these fences you've built, they don't just keep pain out. They keep life out." Jacob's fork stilled. His gaze lifted, sharp and guarded. "You don't know what you're talking about." Eleanor's voice did not rise, but it did not waver either. "I know loss. I buried my husband. I buried the life we planned. I came here with nothing but a trunk and hope for something new. So don't tell me I don't understand." The air between them tightened. Jacob's eyes softened for a moment, but then he pushed back from the table and stood. Without a word, he walked out into the night. Eleanor sat alone, the silence pressing heavily. She felt her strength waver, but she did not regret her words. Some truths needed to be spoken, even if they left wounds before they could heal. Outside, Jacob leaned against the fence post, staring out at the empty fields. Her words replayed in his mind, cutting deep, stirring memories he had long buried. He thought of the grave he had stood beside years ago, the promises broken by fate, the life he had sworn never to risk again. He clenched his fists, the old ache rising. He had built fences to survive, but Eleanor was right. They had also kept him from living. He hated her for seeing it. He needed her to say it. The stars stretched wide above him, silent witnesses. Jacob let out a long breath and lowered his head. Inside, Eleanor finished clearing the table, then sat by the lamp with her sewing. Her hands moved, but her mind stayed on the man outside, the man who carried a weight too heavy for one soul. She whispered a small prayer, not for romance, not even for herself, but that he might find a way to let life back in. And for the first time in many years, Jacob felt the edges of his silence cracking, though he did not yet know if he could let them break. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Jacob spoke little, and when he did, his words were clipped, like the edge of a blade. Eleanor moved quietly through the house, giving him space. Yet her presence lingered in every corner. The fresh bread on the table, the flowers she tried once more to plant. The soft hum of her voice when she thought he wasn't listening. The drought pressed harder. The earth was bare, cattle grew weaker, and even the well closest to the house began to drop lower. Jacob felt the land slipping through his fingers. He had fought so long to hold it, and now it seemed to mock his efforts. One afternoon, the sky darkened with smoke instead of rain. A wildfire sparked far to the west, rolling fast with the wind. By nightfall, its glow flickered red on the horizon, a warning that danger was closing in. Jacob saddled his horse without hesitation. "I'll ride to the line. If it jumps the ridge, we'll need every hand to fight it." "I'm coming," Eleanor said. "No," Jacob snapped. "It's too dangerous." She met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "Danger doesn't mean I'll sit idle while everything we've worked for burns." Jacob opened his mouth to argue, but the resolve in her face silenced him. Finally, he gave a tight nod. Together they rode out, the dry grass snapping beneath the horses' hooves, the fire's glow growing brighter as they drew near. On the ridge, the heat hit them like a wall. Flames licked at the brush, smoke curling thick into the night sky. Jacob swung down, grabbing a shovel, beating at the fire where it threatened to spread. Eleanor followed, covering her mouth with a cloth, her eyes watering as she swung her shovel with all her strength. The fire roared, sparks flying, ash raining down on them. Jacob's muscles burned, his arms heavy, but beside him, Eleanor kept moving, unyielding. In that moment, she was not a city widow, not a guest in his home. She was a fighter, standing shoulder to shoulder with him against the fury of the land. Hours passed, the night a blur of smoke and flame. When at last the wind shifted and the fire turned back on itself, Jacob dropped to his knees, exhausted. Eleanor sank down beside him, her face streaked with soot, her dress singed at the hem. They sat in silence, the fire crackling in the distance, the stars faint through the haze. Jacob looked at her, really looked at the strength in her eyes, the steadiness in her breath despite the fear she must have felt. "You could have died tonight," he said, his voice low. "So could you," she answered softly. For the first time, Jacob's walls trembled. He reached out, almost without thinking, his hand brushing hers, rough skin against soft. The touch brief yet heavy with meaning. Eleanor did not pull away. But just as quickly, Jacob drew back, the old fear rising. He stood brushing ash from his trousers, turning his eyes toward the horizon. "We should check the herd," he muttered. Eleanor said nothing, though her heart ached at his retreat. She followed him back to the horses, her silence carrying more weight than words ever could. As they rode home beneath the fading glow of the fire, Jacob's thoughts churned. He had sworn his life to fences, to dust, to silence, but Eleanor had stood in the flames with him, and still she stayed. He could no longer deny it. She had become part of his fight. The fire left scars across the land, black patches where grass would not grow again for many months. Jacob walked the fences the next morning, his body aching from the night's fight. He saw where posts had burned, wire sagged, and earth still smoking. It would take weeks to repair, weeks he did not have, for the cattle were hungry and weak. Eleanor followed him, carrying water and bread wrapped in cloth. She said little, but when he paused to rest, she was there, steady as the fence post he hammered back into place. Yet the land was not their only threat. Word spread that the rustlers had returned, bolder now, knowing ranchers were tired and broken from fire and drought. Jacob cleaned his rifle each night, his jaw tight, his mind restless. One evening, the sound of hooves carried across the plain again. This time they did not turn away. Shots cracked in the dark, the cattle bawling in terror. Jacob was out the door in a breath, rifle in hand. Eleanor followed with a lantern, her heart pounding, refusing to stay behind. The rustlers had driven part of the herd toward the canyon edge. Jacob rode hard, firing into the air, shouting until his throat burned. The thieves scattered, but not before chaos tore through the herd. One steer crashed through a fence, others bolted in panic, and the ground thundered with their hooves. Jacob fought to turn them, his horse lathered with sweat, his body straining. Eleanor held the lantern high, waving it to guide the cattle away from the cliffs. At last, the herd slowed, milling in confusion but safe from the edge. When silence returned, broken only by the heavy breath of beasts and horses, Jacob lowered his rifle. His hands shook. His land, his cattle, his fences, everything he had worked for stood one step from ruin. Eleanor dismounted, walking to him. Her lantern lit his face, revealing the storm in his eyes. "You built fences to keep the world out," she said, voice trembling but firm. "But fences won't save you from fire or drought or thieves, and they won't save you from yourself." Jacob stared at her, his chest rising with ragged breath. "You don't understand. Everything I ever loved, I lost. The land is all I have left." Eleanor shook her head, tears cutting lines through the soot on her cheeks. "No, Jacob, you still have a choice. You can live for dust and fences, or you can live for more." Her words struck like a hammer against the strongest post. Jacob wanted to deny them, to turn away, to bury himself again in silence. But he couldn't, not now. Not after she had stood in fire and smoke and dust and danger, by his side without fear. His rifle slipped from his hand, landing in the dirt. He looked at her, really looked. The strength in her, the grief she carried, the hope she refused to let die. And for the first time in years he felt the wall inside him break. "Eleanor," his voice caught rough and low. "I don't know if I can." She stepped closer, her lantern casting a warm glow between them. "Then let me help you." The night was still, but in Jacob's heart something began to move again. The night after, the raid hung heavy. Jacob sat on the porch staring into the dark fields, his rifle leaning against the rail. The herd had settled, but his heart had not. He felt as if the land itself was testing him, stripping away every defense he had built. Eleanor came out quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She stood beside him, silent for a long while. The lantern inside the house threw a faint glow across the yard, but out here the stars ruled. At last she spoke. "You fought every battle alone, but alone won't save you anymore." Jacob's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to push her words away. But the truth in them was too sharp. His voice broke low like gravel under a boot. "I told myself no romance, just fences. I thought if I built high enough I'd never have to feel this again." Eleanor turned to him. Her eyes were tired yet steady, filled with a quiet strength that made his chest ache. "And what have those fences given you, Jacob?" "Dust, silence, a table with one chair. You've shut out pain, yes, but you've shut out life too." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I don't know how to let it back in." Her hand lifted, resting lightly over his rough, calloused one. "Then let it be simple. Don't start with promises. Start with choosing not to face the next day alone." Jacob stared at their hands, her touch both fragile and fierce. Memories rose. The grave he had walked away from, the vow he had made never to love again. He had kept that vow with iron and silence, but now, looking at Eleanor, he wondered if the vow had not only saved him from pain but condemned him to emptiness. The wind carried the smell of smoke still lingering from the fire, the dust of the drought, and the sharp scent of the land he had fought for. And yet, for the first time in years, something else pressed stronger, the warmth of her nearness. Suddenly he rose to his feet, restless, pacing the porch boards. "If I let you in, Eleanor, if I let myself care, what happens when it all burns, when it all dies? What happens when I lose again?" His voice cracked with the weight of the past he never spoke of. Eleanor stepped forward, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. She faced him in the moonlight, her face clear and unflinching. "Then you'll have lived knowing love again. That is better than living behind fences until the end." Her words struck deep, breaking through where nothing else had. Jacob's chest heaved, his eyes burning with a grief he had buried too long. He turned away, gripping the rail as if the wood itself could steady him. Eleanor's voice softened, though it held the strength of iron. "You built fences to keep love out, but I came to stay." The silence that followed was vast, stretching between them like the open plains. Jacob closed his eyes, feeling the walls inside him fall like broken posts in a storm. Slowly, he turned back toward her. His voice was raw, stripped bare. "Then stay." For the first time, Eleanor saw the man behind the silence, not the rancher hardened by dust and loss, but the soul still capable of hope. And in that moment, Jacob realized he had more to fight for than land or cattle. He had her. Morning broke softer than any Jacob could remember. The sun rose pale gold over the ridge, lighting the ranch in a gentle glow. The air smelled of dew, not dust, and the silence carried a peace that felt almost new. Eleanor stood at the window, her hair loose around her shoulders, watching the light spread across the fields. The house, once empty and echoing, now held warmth. Bread cooling on the table, flowers gathered in a jar, laughter waiting to be born. Jacob stepped into the room, his boots quiet on the floor. He paused for a moment, looking at her. For years he had looked at the land as if it were all he had, but now, seeing Eleanor, he knew it had never been enough. She turned and smiled, not with the brightness of youth, but with the calm strength of a woman who had known loss and still chosen life. That smile settled in him deeper than any victory he had ever won. The ranch was still scarred. The fences bore marks of fire and storm. The herd was thinner, the earth still thirsty. But there was life here, stubborn and steady. Jacob felt it in the ground beneath his boots, in the air, in Eleanor's presence. Together they walked outside, the light catching the hills. He bent to tighten a fence post and she knelt beside him, pressing her hand into the soil. "It will grow again," she whispered. Jacob nodded. "It will." His voice was steady, no longer hiding behind silence. Townsfolk began to notice the changes. Where once Jacob's ranch had been a place of dust and distance, now it carried a sense of spring. The widow's laughter drifted over the fields, and Jacob's once grim face softened when she stood near. Gossip turned to quiet respect. Some even said the ranch itself seemed greener, as if answering the shift in its master's heart. At supper one evening, as the firelight glowed against the walls, Eleanor set 2 plates on the table. Jacob took his seat, glancing at the chair that had sat empty for too long. This time it was filled. He looked at her across the table. His words were quiet but firm, spoken like a vow remade. No more fences. Eleanor reached for his hand, her touch warm and sure. No more fences, she echoed. Outside, the night settled gently over the ranch. The wind carried not just dust but the promise of rain. For the first time in many years, Jacob welcomed what tomorrow might bring. Once he had sworn there would be no romance, only fences. But the widow had brought more than survival. She had brought spring to dust and to his heart. And Jacob, the rancher who had once lived for nothing but the land, finally understood. Life was not only about the fences he built, but about the love he had let in. If you enjoyed this tale of the frontier, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Shadow Frontier Tales for more stories of grit, dust, and redemption. Your support keeps these legends alive.